The late August heat clung to everything like a second skin, heavy and unmoving, even though the sun had long since slipped behind the horizon. In the stillness of the quiet suburb, with only the cicadas humming through the darkness, Jason sat barefoot in the kitchen, his shirt clinging slightly to his back as the ceiling fan spun lazily above. The house was silent. Still, almost unnervingly so. It was one of those evenings where time stretched and bent, and every sound, the creak of floorboards, the ice melting in his glass, felt louder than it should. He wasn't expecting anyone. His roommate was away for the weekend, the neighborhood had already settled into its usual nightly hush, and Jason had resigned himself to a night alone, music low, drink in hand, and the echo of thoughts he hadn't planned on revisiting. That's when the knock came. Soft. 3 even raps. Not urgent, but sure. Jason froze. He wasn't startled exactly. It was too calm for that. But something in the timing, in the quiet of the hour, sent a ripple through him. He opened the door to find Nate standing on his porch, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, hair slightly damp like he'd just come from a shower or maybe the gym. He looked casual, like he didn't mean to stay long, but his eyes, dark and unreadable in the dim porch light, held a kind of weight that hadn't been there before. Jason blinked. "Hey." "Hey," Nate said, voice low, familiar. Until now. Nate glanced past him, into the dim kitchen. "I saw your lights on. Didn't think you'd be home this weekend." Jason stepped aside before he thought to ask why Nate was here. Plans changed. Nate nodded and stepped in. He didn't ask if he could, just moved past Jason with the ease of someone who'd been here before, though never like this. Not after dark, not alone. Jason closed the door behind him, watching Nate take in the quiet house. "You good?" Jason asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the counter. Nate shrugged. "Yeah. Just needed to not be in my own place for a bit." There was a pause, a space where neither of them spoke, but something hummed between them, a soft, unspoken tension that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had. Maybe it had just gone unacknowledged until now. Nate looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. Sure. They settled on the couch, 2 glasses of whiskey between them, the lights dimmed low, casting the room in amber shadows. Outside, the hum of insects carried through the screen door, and somewhere nearby, a sprinkler hissed to life. They talked. Casual things at first. Work, neighbors. How hot the summer had been. But the words were just scaffolding, holding up the space between glances that lingered too long, between silences that felt heavy with something unnamed. Jason noticed the way Nate sat. Shoulders broad, legs spread comfortably, one arm draped along the back of the couch, relaxed, but not distant. His thigh was close enough to Jason's that the heat of it pressed faintly through the fabric of their jeans. At one point, Jason turned to say something. He didn't even remember what now, and found Nate already looking at him. Not in the way friends looked, in the way someone did when they'd imagined something they hadn't said out loud. The air shifted. Jason's breath caught. He looked away too quickly, reaching for his glass like it could anchor him. "I didn't mean to intrude," Nate said after a moment, his voice softer now. "You're not, nah," Jason said, not looking at him. "You just surprised me." Nate didn't respond right away. When Jason glanced back, he saw the corner of his mouth twitch, like he was holding back something more dangerous than a smile. "Have you ever?" Nate began, then paused, rolling the glass between his palms. Felt like something was going to happen, even if no one said it out loud. Jason swallowed. His heart had begun to beat faster, not out of fear, but anticipation, like the moment before a storm touches ground. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I felt that." Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. Nate shifted closer, just enough that their knees brushed, a simple touch, accidental by design, but deliberate in effect. Jason didn't move. His skin tingled where they touched. The silence was no longer empty. It buzzed with heat. "I think I've been thinking about this longer than I should have," Nate said, his voice low, roughened around the edges. "About you." Jason felt something twist in his chest, a warmth, a nervousness, a sudden pulsing awareness of every inch between them. "Nate, I'm not assuming anything," he added quickly. "But I had to know if it was just me, or if—" Jason turned toward him, fully now, and the space between them disappeared in a breath, their faces close, too close to ignore. "It's not just you," Jason whispered. And then, stillness, a beat, a breath. Jason reached up, his fingers brushing lightly against Nate's jaw. His skin was warm, rough beneath the soft pads of his fingers. Nate didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed for the briefest second. Then they kissed. It was slow at first, an exploration more than a declaration. Jason's lips moved tentatively, tasting, questioning. Nate answered with a gentle pressure, a hand finding Jason's side, anchoring him. The kiss deepened, slowly, as though they both understood the weight of this moment. It wasn't just impulse. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something waiting to be known. When they finally pulled back, their foreheads rested together, breath shallow and shared. Nate's voice was a whisper against Jason's lips. "I didn't know if I should." Jason's hand slid to Nate's chest, resting over his heart. "I'm glad you did." And in the quiet that followed, filled only with the hum of night and the thud of hearts between them, everything shifted. The boundary had broken. Zapitative ChatGPT, the night deepened around them, folding like a velvet curtain over the edges of the world. In the hush of Jason's living room, shadows clung to corners, and the faint lamplight pooled around the couch where they sat. No longer separated, no longer unsure. Something had passed between them in that kiss. Not just desire, but recognition. Like they had unlocked a truth they'd both been circling for far too long. Jason still felt the echo of Nate's mouth on his, the ghost of his breath against his cheek. His fingers rested lightly on Nate's shirt, just over his heart. And though the kiss had ended, neither of them moved far. Their bodies remained angled toward each other, knees touching, the air around them charged with a heat that no fan or open window could cut. Nate's gaze dropped to Jason's hand, still pressed to his chest. His voice came quiet, thoughtful. "It's weird. I thought if this ever happened, it would feel chaotic. But this feels quiet," Jason said, finishing the thought. Nate nodded. "Yeah, like everything else, just shut up for a second." Jason smiled faintly. "That's rare." They didn't speak for a while. There was no need. Their breathing aligned, the occasional squeeze of fingers enough to communicate what words couldn't quite reach. Jason blinked, the words catching him off guard. Why would it be complicated? Jason searched his face, noting how Nate looked away then. Like vulnerability was still something new to him. He gently cupped the side of Nate's neck, drawing his eyes back. "You didn't interrupt anything. You walked into something I didn't know I was missing." The tension between them thickened, not with discomfort, but with something heavier, richer. Nate's eyes darkened just slightly, a slow heat rising behind them as he leaned in again. This kiss was different, more certain. Jason met him halfway, lips parting beneath the weight of shared breath. Nate's hands came to rest at Jason's waist, holding him with quiet strength, thumbs grazing the sensitive spot just above his hips. Jason's body responded instinctively, a low tremor rising through him, his breath catching as he felt the heat of Nate's palms soak through the cotton of his shirt. Their mouths moved slowly, as if savoring every pass, every brush of lips, every delicate shift in pressure. There was no urgency, just a kind of hunger that didn't rush to be fed. When they separated again, Jason rested his forehead against Nate's, their noses brushing faintly. Nate exhaled. I didn't expect tonight to feel like this. Jason's smile was soft, a little dazed. Me either. They sat back, still close, hands tangled again. The silence between them had transformed. No longer tentative or laced with questions, it now settled like something warm, a space they could stretch into. Jason glanced toward the kitchen. You hungry? I've got leftovers I was planning to forget about. Nate laughed, the sound low and genuine. Only if you're not kicking me out. Jason stood, tugging Nate's hand gently. If I was kicking you out, I wouldn't still be holding your hand. They moved into the kitchen, Jason switching on the under-cabinet lights that spilled soft gold across the counters. Nate leaned against the island, watching him pull out a couple of plates and warm something up. The air between them stayed charged, but lighter now. Easier. Jason handed Nate a plate and a fork, and they leaned on the counter together, eating side by side in companionable quiet. Occasionally, their arms brushed, knees bumped, and every contact sent a small current of warmth through Jason's chest. Nate glanced over between bites. You ever wonder how many times we almost had this moment without knowing it? Jason considered that, looking down at the countertop. Yeah, I do. I think about the times I watched you laugh at something dumb I said and felt something twist in my chest. But I told myself it was just the comfort of friendship. Nate set his plate down. I told myself it was loneliness. Jason met his eyes. Do you still think that's what this is? Nate's answer came instantly. No. Jason's hand drifted to Nate's again, fingers sliding over his slowly. Me neither. The plates were forgotten, half finished and cooling on the counter. Jason stepped in closer, his hand finding Nate's arm, trailing up over his bicep. The contact stirred a shiver under his own skin, heat spreading low in his belly, sharp and unmistakable. Nate's breath hitched audibly when Jason's fingers brushed the inside of his wrist. There was a pause, a silent question. Jason leaned in, his voice a whisper against Nate's skin. Stay. Nate's eyes searched his. You sure? Something flickered in Nate's expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper. He didn't say anything, just leaned forward and kissed Jason again. Slower this time. Full of all the things he couldn't say yet. They made their way to the bedroom quietly. Lights dimmed, hands never fully separating. As Jason sat on the edge of the bed, Nate stood between his knees, one hand gently cupping Jason's jaw. You feel like home? He murmured, barely audible. Jason's fingers curled at the hem of Nate's shirt. Then stay. And in the warmth of that darkened room, wrapped in linen and breath and soft, deliberate touches, they let the walls between them dissolve entirely. Not in haste, but in trust. Not a beginning born of chance, but of something they had both, somehow, been waiting for. Morning crept in slowly. its soft gray light slipping through the slats of the blinds, tracing lines across the hardwood floor and the crumpled edges of the comforter. Jason stirred first, not fully waking at once, but drifting somewhere between sleep and sensation. Aware of the arm draped over his side, of the rise and fall of breath against the back of his neck, of the weight of another body anchoring him in the cool sheets. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just let himself feel it. The warmth of Nate's chest pressed lightly against his back, the way their legs had tangled at some point in the night and remained so, as though even sleep had refused to let them drift apart. The steady thrum of Nate's breath, slow and deep, sending a subtle rhythm into the hollow of Jason's spine. It was quiet. Not the quiet of isolation, but of presence, of something real lingering in the space where loneliness used to live. Jason finally turned his head slightly, careful not to disturb Nate too much. His eyes were still closed, brow soft, lips parted just enough to suggest a dream he hadn't yet let go of. He looked peaceful, different somehow. The sharpness he sometimes wore like armor had melted away, replaced with a kind of unspoken ease. Jason studied his face for a while, his own chest tightening at the quiet intimacy of it. There was something surreal about it. Seeing someone so familiar in a context so new, and realizing it felt more right than anything he'd tried to force before. Eventually, Nate stirred, a soft inhale breaking the stillness. His hands shifted, fingers tightening briefly at Jason's waist before relaxing again. He blinked slowly, eyes meeting Jason's in the dappled light. "Hey," he murmured, voice still wrapped in sleep. "Hey," Jason whispered back. Nate smiled, faint and crooked. "I didn't dream that, did I?" Jason shook his head, his own smile rising. "No, you're here. You're really here." They lay like that a while longer, neither speaking. The quiet between them felt full now, not with things unsaid, but with the comfort of knowing they didn't need to be rushed. Eventually, Jason rolled onto his back, stretching slightly. Nate followed the motion with his eyes, propping himself on one elbow to look down at him. "You always look this calm in the morning?" Nate asked, brushing a stray lock of hair from Jason's forehead. Jason chuckled. "No. Usually I wake up in a tangle of sheets and bad dreams, but today..." "Today?" Nate prompted. Jason turned toward him, letting his fingers brush lightly over Nate's forearm. "Today feels different." Nate leaned down, kissing him gently. Just a soft press of lips, more breath than contact. It wasn't a kiss meant to lead somewhere. It was a kiss meant to stay. A kiss that lingered for the sake of it. They spent the better part of the morning moving slowly, making coffee in the kitchen while barefoot, bodies brushing in the narrow spaces between the stove and the sink. Nate stood behind Jason as he poured their mugs, one arm resting around his waist, his chin occasionally dipping to Jason's shoulder. Neither said much, and they didn't need to. The air was full of something better than words. They took their coffee out onto the small back patio, where the wooden deck still held the warmth of yesterday's sun. Jason sat cross-legged in one of the chairs. Nate sprawled beside him, ankles crossed. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves in that soft, meditative way that only summer mornings could manage. Jason turned his head, watching the light filter through the green canopy above them. "This feels like a movie," he said quietly. Nate looked over, one brow lifted. "The kind with a tragic ending or a happy one?" Jason smiled, a little sheepish. "I don't know yet. Depends on what happens when the credits roll." Nate leaned in closer, their shoulders touching. "Then let's make sure we don't fade to black just yet." Their fingers found each other again, resting together between the chairs. Later that afternoon, after Nate had showered and Jason had changed into jeans and a soft tee, they found themselves back in the living room. The echo of yesterday's tension replaced now with something more grounded. They sat side by side on the couch again, but this time there was no question of distance. Nate's hand rested on Jason's thigh, his thumb tracing small circles that sent pulses of heat upward. Jason glanced at him. "You okay?" Nate nodded, eyes fixed on his hand. "Yeah, just taking this in." Jason shifted to face him more directly. "We don't have to label anything right now." Jason searched his face. "It doesn't have to be." Jason reached up, fingers grazing Nate's jaw. "Then let yourself. I'm right here." Nate leaned in again, and this kiss was deeper. Not rushed, but more intense, more open. Jason felt it in the pit of his stomach, in the way his skin tingled where Nate touched him. The heat between them curled tighter, but never spilled over. It was all suggestion, all slow burn, the way their bodies molded together, breath shared, fingers tracing down spines and ribs, not rushing toward anything, but not resisting either. Jason's shirt was halfway untucked by the time they pulled apart, both breathing faster, faces flushed. Nate rested his forehead to Jason's. "You undo me." Jason smiled, breathless. "Good." Outside, the light had shifted again. Longer shadows, the golden edge of evening beginning to fall. But inside, the day felt untouched, like it still belonged to them. And maybe it did. Evening poured itself gently into the corners of the room. Golden at first, then slowly turning deeper, casting long shadows that danced along the hardwood floors and framed the quiet intimacy between them. The television played something muted and forgettable in the background, more ambiance than distraction, while the two men sat entwined on the couch, their legs stretched out, their bodies leaning into each other as though they'd always fit this way. Jason had his head resting against Nate's shoulder, the steady thrum of his heart matching the unhurried rise and fall of their breath. Nate's fingers drifted along Jason's arm in absent strokes, grazing the fine hairs, drawing lazy shapes against his skin. The touch wasn't urgent, wasn't even fully conscious. It was something instinctive now, a rhythm he seemed to fall into without effort. Nate tilted his head slightly, his lips brushing Jason's temple. "I think I've been in that feeling since last night." Jason turned his head, meeting Nate's eyes. The look between them held weight now, softened by closeness, sharpened by the pull of something deeper than either of them had planned. "I used to watch you from my kitchen window," Jason admitted, a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. "You'd be out back messing with that old grill or just pacing your deck with your phone to your ear, and I'd catch myself staring." Nate grinned. "I noticed." Jason blinked. "You did?" Nate nodded, brushing a knuckle along Jason's jaw. "You had this habit of leaning on the counter with your coffee like it was the only thing holding you up. I think I memorized that pose." Jason laughed, heat blooming in his chest. "I thought I was being subtle." "You weren't." The tension between them began to pulse again. Not the sharp, crackling kind from the night before, but a thick, quiet current that pulled them closer, deeper. Their laughter faded into a pause, into a stillness filled only by the hush of their breath and the closeness of their limbs. Nate reached up, cupping Jason's cheek, his thumb traced lightly beneath his eye, a gesture so gentle it made Jason's throat tighten. "I've been alone a long time, Jay. I got good at pretending it didn't matter." Jason leaned into the touch, his hand finding Nate's chest, resting just over his heart. "Me too. I think that's why this scares me." Nate kissed him then, Not hurried, not desperate, just a steady, grounding kiss that told him he didn't need to be afraid. Jason responded instinctively, his hand curling around the back of Nate's neck, deepening the kiss slightly, letting his lips part with a soft sigh as heat flared low in his belly. Their bodies shifted closer, fitting together more fully, Jason's knee pressing between Nate's arm sliding around his waist. The kiss unfolded slowly, like an unraveling ribbon, building on each moment, breath by breath, until their mouths moved together in perfect, breathless sync. Jason gasped softly when Nate's fingers brushed under the hem of his shirt, resting just above his hip, warm and reverent. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't impatient. It was exploration. Not of skin, but of space, of comfort, of what they were allowed to feel when no one was watching. When they pulled apart, Jason's eyes stayed closed a moment longer, his forehead resting against Nate's. You make it really hard to keep pretending I'm not falling. Nate exhaled, a quiet breath against his lips. Then stopped pretending. Jason opened his eyes. Okay. They stayed on the couch for a while, curled together in the quiet, legs tangled, arms resting where they landed. The television flickered against the walls, casting soft light that caught the edges of their profiles. Outside, night had fully arrived, but neither of them moved to close the curtains. The world could wait. Nate eventually pulled Jason closer, resting his chin on top of his head. You feel like something I've been trying to remember. Jason smiled against his chest. Maybe you're remembering what it's like to let someone in. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, full of the quiet reality that they were no longer circling something unspoken. They were in it now, fully. Later, when the dishes were done and the last remnants of dinner cleared, they found their way back to the bedroom. Not because of urgency, but because it felt natural. Because the space they'd carved for each other in that house had expanded, room by room, and now it led them here. Jason stood at the edge of the bed, his shirt already off, bare chest rising and falling with a hush of anticipation. Nate stepped up behind him, hands finding his waist, head dipping to press a slow, careful kiss to his shoulder. You okay? Nate murmured. Jason nodded, his voice rough. Yeah, just overwhelmed, but in the best way. Nate turned him slowly, meeting his eyes, both hands coming to rest on Jason's chest. Then let's just stay here, like this. And so they did. They lay beneath the quiet hush of the ceiling fan, their limbs slowly intertwining again, the heat between them rising in careful waves. Each kiss, each touch, was a question and an answer, a building of trust, a mapping of something they hadn't allowed themselves to hope for before now. They didn't chase the night. They let it carry them, breath to breath, kiss to kiss. And when sleep finally came, they were wrapped in each other, not in uncertainty, but in something that finally had a name. Morning arrived soft and golden, its first light spilling through the bedroom window like a quiet promise. The sheets were tangled, the air still warm with the scent of skin and shared breath. And somewhere between sleep and waking, Jason stirred. He lay still, taking in the way Nate's arm was draped across his waist, fingers resting at his hip with a gentleness that hadn't left since the night before. His breath came slow, steady against the back of Jason's neck. The weight of him, his presence, his warmth, was grounding, anchoring Jason in a world that, for once, felt steady. Jason smiled into the pillow, the kind of smile that stretched without effort. Something inside him had shifted, a quietness that didn't feel empty anymore, but full. Nate murmured something unintelligible, still half dreaming, and shifted closer, their bodies aligning even more. Jason could feel his heartbeat now, steady, a little faster than before, and he closed his eyes again, letting the rhythm pull him deeper into the stillness of the morning. Eventually, Nate's voice broke the quiet, hoarse, soft. "You awake?" Jason nodded, his voice barely more than a breath. "Yeah." A pause, then, "I was scared you'd be gone." Jason turned slightly, enough to look at him. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." Nate's eyes were shadowed with something vulnerable, something that looked too much like the memory of being left. "I've heard that before." Jason reached up, brushing a hand along the side of Nate's face, thumb tracing the faint stubble along his jaw. "Then let me be the one who means it." Nate leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment before he opened them again. "You're dangerous, you know that?" Jason arched an eyebrow. "Me?" The rest of the morning unfolded in soft motions. Showers, shared coffee. Lazy glances across the kitchen island, the sound of Nate's laugh echoing through the space that used to be filled only with Jason's quiet. And when Nate sat on the porch later, sipping his second cup of coffee while Jason leaned in the doorway watching him, the air between them felt different. Settled somehow, like the truth of what they were becoming had taken root and begun to grow. "You know," Nate said, his gaze fixed on the trees beyond the street, "I never thought I'd find this right next door." Jason came to sit beside him, bumping his shoulder lightly. "It's funny how close we let people get without realizing they were the ones we were waiting for." Jason met his gaze without flinching. "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." A long breath left Nate's chest, relief maybe, or surrender. He reached over, lacing their fingers together with a quiet finality that needed no explanation. That night, Nate didn't go home. They made dinner together, bumping hips in the kitchen, stealing kisses between chopping vegetables and boiling pasta. They laughed. They danced for a moment in the living room when a favorite song came on. Just a slow sway in the dark, arms wrapped around each other, foreheads touching. It felt so natural that neither of them remarked on it. They didn't need to. The stillness said enough. When they curled into bed later, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they hadn't dared to hope for. Jason pressed close, his hand resting lightly over Nate's chest, feeling the heartbeat that now matched his own. "You're staying tonight?" Nate kissed the top of his head. "I'm staying." Jason closed his eyes, sinking into the warmth of that truth. And in the hush of that room, in the glow of a night that no longer needed questions or caution, he let go of the weight he'd carried alone for so long. Because now, finally, he wasn't alone anymore.